Okay, I have it at 6 o'clock. We'll call this meeting to order. If I could ask Mr. Meadows if you'll lead us in a moment of silence and the Pledge of Allegiance.
If you're able, let's rise for a moment of silence, and then I'll lead us in the pledge. Let us pledge, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Right. Do I have a motion to go into work session?
So moved.
Second.
A motion and a second. Any discussion? Madam Clerk, if you'll please call roll.
Supervisor Fidjakowski,
Aye.
Supervisor King,
Aye.
Supervisor Biggs,
Aye.
Supervisor Bone,
Aye.
Supervisor Shepherd,
Aye.
Chair Blevins,
Aye.
6 aye.
Into work session.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for spending time this evening to talk about this topic. I know over the past several months, there have been questions at various meetings about the county's emergency services operations and how we are looking at moving things into the future. And that was actually where I wanted to start this evening is over the past several years, when I've presented the budget to the board each year, one of the comments that I've said as part of the budget message each year is focusing on the future and getting the county prepared for what may be coming down the pike in the future. And one of the areas that county staff started being concerned about a couple of years ago was the decline in volunteerism and the decline in some of the rescue agencies' ability to run calls. You know, and it really goes all the way back. I've been here since 2009, and I was here when the Roanoke Rescue Squad was formed a couple of years after I came here. And one of the reasons Roanoke was formed was the fact that Christiansburg was having to cover so many of those calls out into that part of the county. So, you know, during the tenure that I've been here, we've tried to increase volunteerism by creating a new squad, by trying to do a lot of things to ensure that the volunteers were recognized, the volunteers have been appreciated. The challenge, as we've seen in a lot of communities across the country, not just Montgomery County, is that volunteerism in general continues to be on decline. And there's several reasons for that. Some of that has had to do with folks that are just aging out, that have volunteered for 40, 50 years plus, and they're just not able to do it anymore. The other challenge has been with all the various social things and family things that go on anymore, finding volunteers that want to actively run calls has been more and more of a challenge. And specifically where we got to where we are now with paid staffing, with the issues that we started seeing down in the Shawsville area with a lack of volunteers, the lack of ability to cover calls, sometimes going to second and third due for responsiveness. The challenges of when Shawsville wasn't able to cover a call, Christiansburg would go, and then Christiansburg may be shorthanded, and then Blacksburg. We had units running all over the county. And that's when we started talking about maybe we need to begin to look at paid first responders for supplementing the volunteer system. As you know, since that time, Shawsville voted to dissolve. They just did not have the volunteer membership available to be able to cover calls. They voted to dissolve. We've seen periodic challenges in other areas of the county, and that is the reason that the county has gotten into paid staffing. You know, I've said for years that the two primary purposes of local government, county local government, are public education and public safety. And when we talk about public safety, everybody always thinks of the sheriff's office, but it's also volunteer rescue agencies, volunteer fire agencies. That is our responsibility, public education, public safety. And as some of the discussions have gone in months past about, well, the county's trying to run off volunteers or the county's trying to dissolve volunteers. The whole purpose of having paid staff is and was and is to supplement the volunteer system. Now, if the volunteer system can't produce volunteers to run calls, then we have to step up. We can't turn our head to that. And so Michael's here tonight, Brad, staff's here. The whole purpose of this session tonight, from staff's perspective, is to share information, provide answers, because from staff's perspective, we feel like we have been doing what this board has told us to do, and that is ensure that our citizens are taken care of and that calls are answered when they come in. So that introduction, I'm going to be quiet. I know Michael's here. I don't know if Brad's here. I'm not sure. We don't have a formal presentation tonight. We've come equipped with a lot of information. What I thought tonight would be mainly about is just an opportunity to discuss thoughts, concerns, and allow staff to provide information to help you with that.
So do we want to, board, do you want to just start off with some questions? Or Michael, do you want an opportunity to speak first, or do you want, if we have questions?
Michael, one thing you might want to start with is, where are we now? I kind of gave a history. Where are we now with staffing? What areas are we covering? Just kind of an overview of where we are today.
Yeah, so I can start just by giving some background on how we got to where we are. So when I took over this position back in 2020, right before COVID started, and even before that, I had recognized that there were issues, particularly in the Shawsville and Elliston area of the county, with call coverage for EMS. And so Craig and I had a meeting very shortly after I started, and I said, this is an issue that we need to look into. A lot happened with COVID. I left for quite a while and came back, and when I got back, and a fire and EMS agency had been created, and they were just in the foundation stages of getting started. So initially we had started by providing supplemental coverage in the Shawsville-Elliston area as well as the Reiner area during the day. Pretty quickly after we started providing coverage in the Shawsville and Elliston area, there was a particular call that the volunteers weren't able to answer that unfortunately resulted in a fatality. And we recognized that the volunteers just didn't have enough staff to cover the nighttime down there either. So very quickly, and thanks to funding approved by this board, we were able to put together some more staff and provide 24-hour coverage in the Shawsville and Elliston area. Now, as this has continued to go on, we have constantly analyzed where we're at, not just as the fire and EMS department, but where we are as a county, where all of our volunteer departments are at, where we are, because we want to provide the best coverage possible. It's not about anything beyond making sure that our citizens have the responders that they need when they call 911. And with Reiner Rescue, they were at a point too where we recognized that they were starting to decline on the volunteers as well. And so in April, when you all approved the budget, we had some more positions in there to ensure that we could cover Reiner 24/7 as well. Reiner still does have a good core group of volunteers out there that still staff trucks at night. And really all of our purpose out there at night is to provide that paramedic coverage that really can make a difference on those life and death calls. So we're here to support volunteers as much as we can, but we're also here because we have a duty to the citizens of this county to make sure that when they call 911, somebody's coming to help. So that's just a quick brief background. I'm happy to answer any questions that you all may have, and I know that there's probably going to be a lot that comes up tonight. So
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Supervisor Bone.
Could both of you, or whichever of you, talk about, it's not like the county unilaterally came up with a solution to get paid staff. I expect that you talked to the volunteers about it, or was it a unilateral county solution?
I won't say it wasn't a unilateral decision. Ultimately, it was this board's decision to fund paid staff, but that was only after a number of conversations at the time with Shawsville Rescue, because that, as Michael indicated, that was the concern that presented itself first, is there were just calls not being covered. And we had several meetings with the captain of Shawsville Rescue. Supervisor Fijikowski was involved with those, a couple of those, being the board rep from down there. And we, again, stressed we wanted to, what can we do to help you add volunteers? What can we do to help you secure coverage? They just were never able to get the manpower being generic, they just weren't able to get the responders to cover calls. And that's when we recommended in the budget, and I don't even remember which budget it was now, I guess it was 2 budgets ago, that we began to provide funds to be able to supplement that coverage in Shawsville.
In my experience working as a leader in nonprofit, it's very difficult to find volunteers all the way around. Simple example is this. What the county has done well is the RSVP program. It has paid staff, but I understand it's also funded differently. So was there ever any discussion about having paid staff to help with the volunteer?
Well, that was the intent of what we were doing, is to make sure we had paid first responders so that in situations where the volunteers weren't able to be available for calls, we could provide coverage. And what happened with Shawsville is over time, and you guys may want to speak to that, I'm looking to Brad too, we watch the call response. Jason's here from the 911 authority. I mean, we see the statistics when calls are dispatched for a particular agency, and then they have to go to what's called second due, or even third due if they're not getting responses. Shawsville was not responding to calls.
Have we ever not funded a request from the volunteers to recruit volunteers in any financial way?
Not to my knowledge,
Okay.
no ma'am.
Thank you.
I'd like to add just to that, the reason to do the paid staff was also after concerns with the other localities saying that they couldn't sustain, for example, town of Christiansburg answering Shawsville's calls. That meant they weren't available to answer the calls within the town, and it became a ripple effect that other outside agencies would cover Christiansburg while Christiansburg is covering Shawsville. And basically, we were told in some meetings that they couldn't sustain that, and it would come to a point that they may have to stop that because the burden was too great on them. And that was another considering factor when I was involved in those discussions. And it's not just the town of Christiansburg, also the city of Radford talked about their challenges as well. And then when there are incidents on the interstate that all of us, mutual aid, but it was constantly that Christiansburg was answering the majority of those calls in Shawsville because of a lack of volunteers, and they could not sustain that and keep providing for their citizens as well. So that was the discussion. Mayor Barber had said several times that was challenging for them. Supervisor Fijikowski.
Yeah, being from the district that first suffered this loss of volunteers, I can say it's not been easy. And when we met with Shawsville, I think we met on 2 occasions actually, but I remember one that they had, this was one of their regular meetings, they only had 6 people, and this was 3 years ago, I think it was. So things have been tough for a long time. And everything that's been said so far is absolutely true. You can't put the burden on the bigger squads just because they're bigger. We have to try to give a proper response to everybody in the county. And of course, probably my district and Supervisor King's district being so large and so rural, it's a challenge. It really is a challenge. But I can go back, I think it was 4 years ago that Craig and I started looking into this, especially other counties that have gone down the same path. And some of the information we got from them was quite interesting. They would have one squad would be all volunteers, and they would have another one that was all paid. And they kind of worked it out that way. And I know Rockingham was one county. What was Augusta? Was it-
Rockingham and Augusta were the two we had a lot of conversation with.
Yeah, because we wanted to know what we were getting into, because we certainly was never any intent to offend any volunteer. That was never the case. It's always been, do we have a sufficient number to respond to calls? And that's just the way it is. And I have to say that being on the Fire and EMS Commission, the 911 Center and all the representatives from the departments have come up and agreed on various changes. And there have been several changes that have been made to try to minimize any kind of interruption. And they've done a great job, but, you know, at some point, it was time for the county to step in, and I think we did that, and I think we did a good job of that. But again, it was never an intent to run anybody off, and we certainly always offered the option, if they weren't able to ride with their squad because there were so few, they could ride with ours. So we tried to keep them active if that's what they wanted to do, but again, just the numbers aren't there, and unfortunately, it looks like that's the way it goes. Everybody you talk to around the state says something similar, so it's definitely a trend. Maybe it'll reverse, who knows, I don't know. But if it does, we can handle that too. We can restaff them, so that's all I got.
Supervisor King.
I know we've had probably 4 meetings separately, you know, Craig, you and Brad and I. And I asked this question, I'm going to ask it again tonight. Is any other department having trouble running their calls?
I think to answer that, the proper answer would be, we could provide this board the data you need, but ultimately I feel that that's this board's decision to come up with that answer. They need to look at the data, the call response data, and make that determination. I don't think that my opinion or Michael's opinion should be interjected into that. You could ask me and I could say one thing, you could ask Michael and say another. Ultimately, it is the board's, I feel like it's the board's responsibility to look at the call data, to look at the response data, the times, the number of staff, and decide, is this adequate or is it not? I think that's the proper way to proceed. I'm not sure how Mr. Mehta feels about that.
No, I totally agree. I mean, that's pretty much where we got to with Shawsville, is we shared that when we were talking about adding paid staff, we shared that information with the board so you could see firsthand.
But also, we ask for expert assistance to interpret the data. Maybe Supervisor Fidjikowski and King and Shepard, as well as Chair Blevins, maybe the rest of, I can't necessarily interpret some data about it. So having some input as we ask questions, I think is fair.
I think having the data, the numbers, so that we could make those, and also we had the fire study, the fire service study that was, gave us some, independent study that gave us some insight on what we were doing very well and where we lacked. And as we move towards the future, we will need to look and be able to analyze what that data means. What are the, it's interesting, I found out, the requirements or the national requirements, and again, I'm not an expert, Supervisor Bone, so we'll go to the experts for that, but the minimum requires on a fire engine, the minimum requires for an ambulance, and learning all of that. Are we adequate with our emergency services? Are we being able to provide protection 24/7. And there's not a doubt in my mind that everyone in this room, the board, and every volunteer out there, there's not a doubt in my mind that we don't have or working for the same goal, and that is to protect our citizens, to provide the best service at the quickest response. If that wasn't your goal, you wouldn't give up your time, training, and effort to do that. Just a couple weeks ago, we recognized decades of experience and service that we're indebted to. But as the county grows and the reasons, there's not one pinpoint reason for the decline in volunteerism, and it's nationwide. Surrey County, Pennsylvania County, Madison. Anytime you could go Google for the ambulance and the volunteers, they're just declining. People aging out, health problems, family commitments. You have to work. We get it. If you're working a 9-to-5 job, you're not able, and you're working in Radford or you're working in Roanoke, you just can't leave your job and go answer a call. We understand that. And we're indebted. So I think everyone in this room has the heart of service to know that we want to do what's best for our citizens. You wouldn't be a volunteer and give up your time, sacrifice from your family. Some members, this is a lifetime for them. Sometimes this is a family that generations from their granddad served, their dad is in the volunteer rescue squad, and we are so appreciative of that. But we do need to look at where we are. There's a gap, and we need to be able to fill that gap to best provide for our citizens. What are the questions and data that we need? Some of it we've already been provided.
I also wanted just to clarify something. It's not just Brad and Michael. I think all of our chiefs and their volunteers are experts too. So using all the resources that we have to interpret the data to make the right decisions is what I'm trying to get at. Sorry to interrupt you, Supervisor.
No, you're good. What I'd like to see at 911 can do is how many calls have they had to turn over to another station? When they set the tones off of one department, how many times they have to set them off for another department because that one department did not answer the calls?
I like the idea, like Supervisor Fidzikowski and Mr. Meadows, you got the data from Rockingham County, whatever is equivalent around the Commonwealth to make sure that we're meeting, if not exceeding, expectations to serve our residents, I think is important.
And also, I guess the collection of that data is an issue. I guess the board saw most of the responses or saw a copy of the responses to the VACO survey. And that just, again, is to reinforce that this is a statewide program. VACO asked a survey of questions about emergency and fire services. VACO is Virginia Association of Counties. And so to each county, they have provided a survey, and they just ask general questions. Some of these questions, Montgomery County, this board could not answer. So that's concerning. When we're asking how many volunteers do we have, we're not sure of the answer. So those are things that we need to make sure, and I know we've asked, and we may have some of that information now. But at the time of the survey, we were unable to answer some of those questions, and that's concerning.
But the study that we had done, I've talked to other localities that got it, and I haven't read this whole one that we have. But the majority of the localities I have talked to, somewhere in that study, it says they would like to have by 2030 paid fire and EMS in every locality in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Now, I don't know if ours says that or not.
It does speak to some options for that. Quite frankly, we haven't really examined that because we don't feel at this time that it's something that we need to look at. We kind of feel like there are some things that we can do to get the records or get the data that we need to look at, like Mr. Meadows is explaining, the future. My concern is not as much about what we're doing now as where will we be in 5, 10, or 15 or 20 years? Because, since I've been here a year and a half, every board meeting I come to, it seems like Bree or some of her staff are up here talking to you folks about a subdivision or a truck stop or something that's coming to Montgomery County. And I know from a law enforcement standpoint, the more houses, the more calls. And that's the same thing for EMS and potentially fire. And the more traffic, the more crashes. And so my concern is, like I said, it's not as much about what's going on now, but are we in a position in 10 or 15 or 20 years, whoever happens to be standing here at that time, to say that we're covered, whether it's volunteers that have been able to add staff, add locality, add stations in different parts of the county. I spoke with Chief Duncan with Reiner about this the other night, about the 177 corridor, for example, is going to develop at some point. It's just inevitable. It's one of probably the last major arteries off of the interstate that doesn't have everything balled up. And when it does, how do we get there from an emergency services standpoint? And do we need another station out there? Maybe not next year, definitely not next year, but in 5, 10, 15 years, are we going to need one? There's a probability that we will, and at that time, the land may be gone. And so I worry about if we're not preparing and thinking in that forward enough, that the county may be at some point in a situation to where we realize, or they realize, we need a station here, whether it's EMS, fire, combination, whatever, but we don't have the land. We can't, it's all balled up, it's all developed. So now we have to go somewhere that's not optimal and do that. And from a training standpoint and a personnel standpoint, if we have enough volunteers now to cover everything, how many will we need if Montgomery County grows from 100,000 population to 140 or 130 or whatever in the next 20 years? How many more calls is that going to be? How does that project out, and what type of staffing will you need? And how can we make sure that we get there? Is that, all volunteer, all paid? We don't know. Nobody has a crystal ball, but we know that if we need 30 people to do it, we got to make sure we have 30. And so we need to be continually examining that. So I think my approach is more thinking about, like Mr. Meadows says, the future, and making sure that the county is set up to survive in the future, no matter what it is, whether it's volunteer, career, or whatever that may be, that we have enough responders to answer those calls.
May I ask a question?
Certainly, Supervisor Bone.
I can't tell you how excited I am about hearing you talk about the future, and I'm sure Supervisor Biggs is too, because she always talks about it that way, about planning. Because I'm very concerned about what happened this year with our budget. Our budget stayed exactly the same, but we absorbed all the extra expense of EMS that we added to our budget. So the rest of the county actually went backwards in our budget because we added an expense but kept the budget the same. And I was thinking about this as I was driving over here tonight. If you do that too long, then at some point it will impact your credit score. Not that the credit score is everything, be all and end all, but if we're not planning for the future financially all the way around, it's going to be problems throughout the county and not just for EMS. Thank you.
I don't think, did our budget grew, did it not?
Excuse me, our budget did grow. We kept the tax rate the same, but we had growth that allowed our county budget to grow in addition to the funding that we provided in EMS.
But the growth of the funding for EMS was quite high compared to the growth in other departments throughout the county.
That is correct.
Thank you.
Supervisor Fizikowski.
The future is kind of something we discussed at a commission meeting not too long ago, and pretty much everybody in the room agreed. If we're not planning for the future, then we're going to be hurting when it comes time. So I think everybody's in agreement that we need to plan for it. As far as the money, where the money is going to come from, I think we have to deal with that when we know how much money we'll need. I can't see raising taxes now and putting it away in a kitty if we're not going to need that. So I don't think that's going to be an issue. I think this board has, in years past, and I'm sure that Supervisor Biggs can speak on a lot of this, when critical issues arise, then yeah, the board has to deal with finding the money somewhere. So I think that that's going to happen. But it's the planning. And in the planning that we've done so far, it has sent little ripples through a lot of the departments thinking, oh, we're doing something without them. And I think Mr. Sinclair is trying to explain, no, that's not the case. We have to talk about the future. Nobody should be afraid of it. It's going to come if you live long enough. And, you know, we need to talk. We need to speak on that. And there's some issues tonight I think we're going to speak on, too, on especially when it comes to the rescue building that we want to put back into Shawsville. And that's something that we need to also discuss. But I'll let somebody else jump into that one.
I'd like to just clarify. I think a number of us were surprised about the cost of the new vehicle. And I think it was Chair Blevins that said, that's almost a penny of our tax rate. That we weren't really, all of us weren't thinking in the back of our heads that we had to have that in our budget, you know. So it is present, and I understand we're trying to get our hands around it. I'm just saying it's all, you know, I can't speak well enough about the planning that's going on. Thank you.
Well, and I'm glad you brought up the vehicles, because I think that was one of the questions that we had submitted, and we do set aside money for that. And we do allow the committee on the Fire and EMS Commission to decide where that's going to go. So I think that's covered, so.
So since we're on that topic, and I know we're probably kind of all over, maybe we can start one topic, and if somebody has questions and follow up. So I think you're talking about when the two fire purchases that I was unsure what this purchase was, what description, because I'm not an expert in fire apparatus. And the question, and we do give 1.5 cents that we put to capital. That's about $1.8 million. And so my concern wasn't not over, do we need a fire truck or not? I would like, as we move forward in the future, the Fire and Rescue Commission, that is an advisory board, just like any other advisory board, to come and present to this board what your recommendations are and give us a presentation, give us some explanation. I learned a little bit about, maybe other members don't know the difference between a tanker and an engine and why you have to have this equipment. So we're talking about taxpayers' money that at the end of the day, I'm responsible for, I'm accountable for. And so I think it would be good for this board to know, and being transparent to our citizens, that we know what the recommendations are. And then I had a question about, well, you know, why do we need it? And then Mr. King, you said, well, it's somebody's turn. And then I questioned, well, wait a minute, what do you mean it's somebody's turn?
Well, what I meant was, and I should have carried forward with it, Fire and Rescue Commission does a wonderful job what they do. And when I said Mary's turn, your turn, whatever, I should have carried on with my conversation. Fire and Rescue Commission keeps up with people's tankers and engines and command vehicles and all that. That's what I meant by that. It's time to replace them, and each department has a time to replace. And that's how, because if y'all remember here several years ago, we got behind on replacing vehicles. And that's why we upped the money for Fire and Rescue Commission. So they keep up with, so this board don't have to, because majority of us probably don't know how to keep up with that. And that's one of their jobs, is to keep up with who needs a vehicle replaced.
And I just want to make sure that COVID happened after that was upped. And we all know how much inflation COVID brought through the system, that's enough moving forward for all of Fire and Rescue. So that we're not surprised later on It accumulates for that $1 million truck,
Well, it's like Craig said in the meeting, when brought up that, I think it's $1.1 million for the truck. This is the new norm now.
I was just getting ready to say that $1.1 million truck, wasn't that long ago, that truck was $600,000. And it is the reality. And this board has been very, when I talk to other county administrators, they're amazed that our board allows us to set aside $1.50 for capital equipment. And because a whole lot of communities don't do that. And that's one thing that we've tried really hard to ensure that the volunteers that are out there running calls have the best equipment that's available to them. But I think, the numbers, and candidly, as we talk about other projects going forward, some of these facilities projects we're working on, all the numbers are getting to be eye-popping right now, and that's the world we're in. And again, going back to focusing on the future, what I charged Brad with when he came up here as Assistant County Administrator, and what Michael and I have been talking about since the day he walked through this door is, and I'm going to go back and say it again, what can we be doing to ensure that our citizens have the best responses available to them if they pick up the phone? When we talk about response time, do our citizens, when they call 911, do they expect 15 or 20 minutes for somebody to get there? Or do they want it 5 to 7? Those are things this board and we need to talk about, because it's all funding driven and the way we structure things. But the challenges are out there for the future, to be sure, and the dollars, not only for personnel to ensure that we have those first responders, but also to ensure we have the equipment that's available. And that's also what has brought up some of the question of accountability too, is as the dollars get bigger, are we making sure that all those dollars that are out there are properly accounted for and used? I have no doubt that they are, but we don't have anything that shows that they are sometimes.
Yeah, since we're bringing up the equipment, I had mentioned something when we were discussing that, when we came up with the questions, and I had thought, using 40-year-old information, that the equipment, the trucks, affected the ISO rating, and that is not the case. Michael, can you speak to that Insurance Services Office rating and what they look at as far as setting their rating?
Brought it with me just in case you had a question on it. So I'll start by saying I'm by no means an expert on this. We do a lot of research to try and make sure that we're well prepared to answer questions that come up. I'm sure there's some folks in the audience that may know a lot more about this than I do. But when it comes to the ISO rating and talking about fire apparatus, they're not necessarily looking at the age of the vehicle. They're looking at the serviceability of the vehicle. Has it been maintained? Does it operate well? What kind of capacity does it have as far as how much water does it carry? What equipment does it carry on it? That's more of what they look at, not necessarily the age or the condition of the truck, but is it still serviceable?
Yeah, and I believe that that the committee looks at a life expectancy, and that's set for each vehicle, correct? I think some vehicles, like, don't they time to replace it like 10 years, while others are like 20 years?
Yeah, and I can talk through some of that too if you'd like me to. I brought that list with me tonight just to give you all a brief explanation. I'm on the CIP committee. I'm not a voting member of the CIP committee. There are some here that are on that committee as well. But the CIP committee is a branch of the Fire and Rescue Commission that is responsible for the replacement of fire and EMS apparatus in the county. So it's up to that committee to decide what the priorities are, what needs to be replaced, when does it need to be replaced. And that's all based off of a spreadsheet that Chief Hanks from Christiansburg has come up with. So when we look at the CIP for fire and EMS equipment, There are 6 categories that we look at for vehicle replacement. So we have ambulances, brush trucks, mini pumpers, engines, tankers, and pumpers, response vehicles, and crash rescues or squad trucks. So many of the departments in this county have all those vehicles that are in various stages of their life. And so when it comes time to look at the replacement of a vehicle, we examine, what does that department need? Are they in need of a new engine? Are they in need of a new response vehicle? And that committee's tasked with prioritizing that list. We do have a wide range of equipment across this county. I'll give you the answers that we provided in the VACO survey that you all referenced. So countywide, we have 54 total fire apparatus. That ranges from those response vehicles to your fire engines, tanker trucks, the whole gamut of what fire departments have. And we have 24 ambulances countywide across all of our volunteer and career agencies. But that's a brief explanation of how the CIP committee works. It's based off of the years that those vehicles have been in service, not necessarily the mileage, but how many years does that vehicle have on it?
Okay, that takes care of what the equipment part, but what else do they look for in ISO to come up with the rating?
So there's 16 categories that they look at for a total of 105.5 points. I'll read through that list real quick, and then if you all would like greater explanation, I'd be happy to provide it. So the biggest piece of the ISO rating is on water supply, not just what the department has sitting in their station with their fire apparatus, but how many fire hydrants do you have? What kind of water pressure do you have on those hydrants? So that's the biggest piece of the ISO rating. That's worth 30 points. And then from there, company personnel, deployment analysis, training, inspection and flow testing of hydrants, engine companies, community risk reduction, telecommunications, ladder, special service companies, emergency reporting, dispatch circuits, pump capacity, hydrant size, type and installation, operational considerations, reserve pumpers, and reserve ladder and special apparatus.
And would you explain what is ISO and how does that affect us and what are the ratings? What are the span of the ratings?
So the ISO rating, essentially what it does is it determines the need for insurance coverage within any sort of area based on what capability the fire department has within their control and outside of their control. Water supply being one of those things outside of their control. So there are certain things within this ISO rating that the fire departments can do themselves to better that rating. There are some things that they can't, that they have no say in. But the ISO rating determines how much businesses, homeowners will have to pay for insurance coverage based on the service that their first due fire department provides.
And how is it, what are the ratings? 1 being number 1, 3 being the worst? How is the span of the ratings?
So number 1's the highest you can go, and I could be wrong in saying this, but I believe the lowest that you can rate is a 9 or a 10.
And so when you go 9 and 10, obviously the highest rates, the best rates are 1 to 2.
Yes, ma'am.
Where are our agencies?
I don't have that information here for you tonight, but I can definitely get that for you.
Do you have any idea what range we have in the county?
We have anywhere from a 3 to a 10.
And it's not particularly assigned to an agency. There may be multiple agencies within that. It's a geographic area that they examine. So they're looking at the PSA water supply. They're looking at how far the fire department is from the community center, the housing. So if you're in an area like Reiner, for example, where there's a lot of housing close to the fire department, that's better. If you're in an area where the fire department and most of your housing is further away, that's not as good. So they look at geographic areas as well. It's not assigned to like an agency for a rating. It's that particular area. So I'm not sure how many we have in the county. I think we have at least 3 zones. It may be more.
And I'm not saying that Rockingham County is exactly the right county that we're supposed to compare ourselves to, but You know, we have so much rural in this county. You know, you can't put a fire station in Catawba Valley. That doesn't make any sense, you know? So I don't know, you know, if a 10 in one category is really bad for us, you know? I don't know. I'm not an expert, I can tell you that.
Well, what I've seen over my years of experience is when you have a lot of rural areas, their ISOs are, the ratings are usually lower for a whole host of reasons. What you try to do, though, is working with the volunteer agencies, as Michael mentioned with some of those things, they are what they are. But a few of those other things, if we can help boost those, that helps, maybe it gets it from a 10 to an 8 or an 8 to a 6. If we can help with those things, that's what we want to be able to do. Because in the end, we always talk about taxpayers and tax dollars. Well, if you get your homeowners insurance and other insurance each year and see what that's been doing the last year or two, anything we can do to help there through fire and rescue, I mean, that's what we need to try to do.
So in addition to this rating, whether it's 1 to 10 or the 105 points, however the right measure is, it'd be nice to know how that's reflected in homeowners insurance. If you move from a 10 to an 8 in one category, it's going to give you a 1% decrease in, versus a 10 to an 8 in another category, maybe it's going to give you a 10%. I have no idea, but I think that's important to know.
I don't know that it works exactly that way. I think my understanding is that when it drops to the lowest rating is when it impacts your residential homeowners, and above that, it's your more commercial, industrial buildings are impacted. I think a couple of things to maybe touch back on the equipment, and Supervisor Blevins brought up a point about wanting a presentation. I think we have spoke with Chief Hanks, who chairs that committee, and he, moving forward, he or whoever is the chair of that committee is dedicated to bringing that presentation in. So that will occur moving forward. So hopefully that will help inform the board of what's being purchased and so you'll get that information that you're looking for moving forward. And with respect to the ISO, the different areas of the county get the reports at different times. So the last one we received was last year, and we did drop there. And if I've attached that report for your review, and if you look at that, there are some things I think we can do to bring that back up. And I'm not saying that those things weren't done. Maybe they were done but weren't documented, or they were done and documented but didn't get communicated to the ISO agency. Don't really know, but I think moving forward we can try to help look at those things as they're going on and make sure that we're getting what we need to do there to get as high a rating as we can.
Is that county-wide? So is it one rating for the county, or is it Shawsville? It has one rating.
It's geographic.
Different zones.
Different zones within the county will determine, okay, thank you.
If I may, this may be a good segue or opportunity to mention something as well. I know there's been a recurring comment that I've heard for months that, with the county getting involved with paid first responders for EMS, that the county is looking to get into paid fire responders as well. And I've made the comment 100 times. The whole reason that we're in this period is to supplement volunteers. It's not to replace volunteers or run volunteers out. Well, somebody the other day said to me, well, why don't you just call it the Department of EMS instead of the Department of Fire and EMS? There's a host of reasons, and Brad, you may can elaborate on a couple when we were looking at staffing and the way accounting for hours work. But what you've just heard in this discussion about ISO and trying to identify things to help the volunteer agencies, that's the reason we call it fire and EMS. We're working on both sides. We're not working to replace anybody. We're trying to supplement and support. And
Yeah, I mean, that's true, because There's some advantages to having it set up the way it is. One is the shifts that our folks are able to work, the exemption that they're able to get for hours. If you're a fire agency, you're able to do. A lot of the staff that we hired came in with basic or some advanced firefighter training, and it's been advantageous to some of the departments. Our basic rule is if a department asks for their help, then they help them. And so we wanted to make sure going in that if this person is an EMT on an ambulance and they show up on a scene and a volunteer fireman asks for their assistance, that they can do that, but we want them to be covered. So if they get injured, we don't have a bunch of what ifs and, well, you're not a fire department. Why are they doing this? We have that covered. Also, if it comes down to a point that they are helping from time to time with fire response upon request, they can be counted in as responders, which the more responders you have, that can potentially help that ISO rating. So it's not that I've said this 100 times, we're not going out here and buying fire trucks and trying to put them on there to go fight fires. If a volunteer fire agency asks for their help, they've went and they've helped. And if they're not asking for help, they're not going to go help. They're an EMT. We're an EMS agency for the most part, but we do have people that are trained and can go help when needed.
Can I ask a question
Super
that
Vice
goes
Chair?
to sort of what you're talking about, Brad? So I'm just going to pretend like there's a call and there are volunteers and there's paid staff. How does it work when whoever gets to the call? Like, is there a policy about who does what, or, are the paid folks there to, like we're talking about, supplement the volunteers? Or explain to me what happens. And the reason I'm asking this question is I keep hearing various scenarios of what happens, and I really would like to know what happens. And do we need to make a policy that's clear so folks know what to do? Or I don't know, because I'm certainly not an expert in this, but I really want to know how it works.
Well, Michael, jump in here when I mess this up, but obviously that is so dependent upon what the call is. Mm-hmm. If it is a fire call and our EMTs and paramedics go, they're there to render emergency aid. There again, if they're there and volunteer fire says, hey, help us couple this hose or do whatever around that truck or on the outside of that structure, they can help. If it's an EMS call and they're responding as a paramedic and an EMT to answer that call. If there's a volunteer agency that's in that response zone, then the only one that we have now that does that is Reiner. If that call goes out and Reiner has a truck staffed, they're getting dispatched to it at the same time. If it's a high acuity call, meaning it needs a paramedic, or it could need a paramedic, then our truck is the primary truck. Our intent is if it's not a high acuity call, not something that should potentially need a paramedic, and Reiner has a truck staff, then the volunteer truck would answer that call if they have a truck to go to it. But it's really just so dependent upon what the call is, what the circumstances are, where it's at, who kind of gets it and gets to it. As far as a written policy, I'm not sure. There are some mutual aid agreements, that a truck will go outside of their first due zone when requested by another agency. They can do that, and they'll go and render that. But those are all kind of agreed upon mutual aid operational policies. And I'm sure, Michael, if you want to add anything to that, or.
I think Brad hit it pretty well. It's so dependent on the call type as to what's going to happen when everyone gets there. Like Brad said, our primary focus is EMS. If there's a patient there, our folks aren't doing anything but making sure that patient is okay. If they're there and there's no one to help, then they will either sit there or they will take commands from whoever the fire officer in charge is. And that could range from continuing to just stand by or helping them in whatever case or whatever they may need. But it just depends. It's really hard to write a policy when every call is different.
Well, I'm just thinking, like, if I'm the person that is in distress, or I'm the person making the call, I'm expecting the best qualified people who are going to come and help me. And I want that for our county. I want that equity across the county for all our citizens. And I want the response time to be equal as far as we can get it, because it's just so important. It's critical. And so I'm learning a lot tonight. I'm learning a lot, and I'm glad we have the folks in the audience, because there's so much I don't understand. And I guess my next question would be, so when you've been in these situations, how does it go? Is everyone getting along with each other to answer the calls, or are there problems that need to be worked out with relationships? I mean, I don't know. That's why I'm asking. I'm just putting it out there.
I think there's always, hiccups that you're going to experience. There's always going to be some of that. It's the nature of emergency services. I may get in trouble for saying this, but in law enforcement, it's very territorial. Emergency services can be very territorial. Fortunately, I think at the end of the day, for the most part, everybody says, okay, we may have had a disagreement. Let's take care of the patient. Let's take care of whatever, and we sort it out afterwards. And I think we've had a lot of that. We've had many discussions with different chiefs about, they maybe not like how we handle something, so we've made some adjustments. I think for the most part, things seem to be pretty calm now. I mean, I'll just say, starting out, Michael was gone. I had a meeting with every rescue chief in the county, invited them to a meeting, and we kind of talked about what we were doing. We got feedback. We made some adjustments. We've talked about it at the commission. And I remember being in a meeting, and we were starting up in Shawsville, and we were getting ready to open up Creedfield about at the same time. And I remember saying to the staff in the room, volunteer staff and our staff, I said, why don't we both send a truck to Creedfield? Have a Shawsville volunteer truck there, a county truck there. Let's greet the citizens down there. Let's show that we're working together to serve them. And we agreed to do that, and then afterwards, it just fell apart. I don't know why. We sent our truck. No other truck showed up, and, I got kind of labeled as whatever. But the intent was to really show that we're trying to work together, that we're serving the community together. And we still want to do that as much as practically possible, and I think we still do that. So I hope that, there will continue to be hiccups. People are people. And in emergency services, they're all, for the most part, hard chargers, and their call goes out and they want to go answer it, and they want to get there and help someone, and sometimes that creates a rub. But fortunately, I think for the most part, those things have been able to get worked out, and everybody makes little adjustments along the way until we find something that's workable. And that's kind of what we're doing.
I sort of see this as a sort of a team approach, and trust is so important, and to develop those kind of relationships so that, and I know it takes time. I just know from my limited experience in teaching, when anything different came along, a lot of us had the same reaction, like, I don't really want this person in my classroom. I can run my own classroom. I don't need a cooperative teacher or a second teacher. But then it sort of develops, but it takes time. And I think I just want to express, and I think all of us, we so care about our volunteers, and we trust our volunteers, and they've been the boots on the ground. And yet, I think going back to what Chair Blevins said, we wanted to support our volunteers so that we could provide the services for our citizens. And so I guess we're all sort of in uncharted territory, trying to work together to work this out. And that's sort of the way I'm seeing it right now. I don't know if there's anything else I should ask at this time, but maybe just listen, and then if I have a question, I'll ask later.
Well, Supervisor Biggs, just to tag on to that, I made a comment earlier about how some of my colleagues in other counties are amazed, number one, at how much the county sets aside for capital equipment. The other thing that they are more amazed at is the fact that we're in 2023 and we still have the strong base of volunteers that we have. Most of these other communities, you know, we have conversations all the time about, you know, they're seeing agencies drop, just drop. And I asked Jen to pull together some information. I'll make sure I forward that to everybody. It's not just Virginia. It's not just the Southeast. It's nationwide. I get it. I'm a member of the ICMA group, which is a national city county managers. Nearly every other day in our newsletter, there's some issue about some locality that's struggling to cover calls. And that's just the nature of where we are, but we are so dang blessed. And, you know, I've used that word since we first started talking about this, supplement the volunteers. That's what we want to do, is supplement the volunteers. If it reaches a point in time where the volunteer base just cannot cover the need anymore, then we, talking about focusing on the future, we want to be prepared to be able to address that. We don't want an agency 2-3 years from now to come in and say, we just can't cover calls anymore, and the board look at the staff and go, what are you going to do? And we go, I don't know, give us 6 months and we'll get back to you. We can't do that. We have to be ready to respond.
And ultimately, our decisions, you know, while we're working together, we are responsible. We all are responsible, this board, staff, and the volunteers, for providing this service. And there has been, you know, there was a pretty big rub with Reiner for a while about us putting a paramedic there. And but the decision was made because we needed a paramedic in that community. And removing a paramedic and putting them in another part of the county to respond to Reiner, we didn't feel like was a viable option. We felt like that one had been funded and one needed to stay in the Reiner community to answer those calls. And so I know that had upset some folks. We met many times, staff did, with those folks and explained why. And, you know, we just didn't want to have a situation to where either our paramedic was responding from Shawsville or Christiansburg to a call and was delaying that response, or if we didn't have one and they were relying on Christiansburg to send one and Christiansburg was tied up, now Blacksburg has to send one, and somebody in the Reiner community is waiting many more minutes to get that resource that they need. And so that's kind of why we took the position that we did. And I don't know if that's maybe what you've heard some issue about, but that, you know, that was a pretty big issue, but I think that we just had to stay the course with what we were doing.
Thank you.
Supervisor King?
I'm gonna bring this up again. I know I brought it up twice before. When we first started this paid and volunteer side, I asked this board, because I've talked to other localities what they done. We could do this the right way. We still have time to fix this so everybody can get along. Everybody here tonight I've heard say, we want everybody to get along. I would like to see us have a committee with one volunteer from each department in the county and maybe one or two from the paid side. That way, it would do a lot of work for the whole county as a whole. Like if Reiner Fire was going down on their calls, wasn't covering them, that committee could see that to start with. And as Craig said, 6 months down the road, it wouldn't be 6 months. We could come back to this board and say, look, they're not doing what they need to do. We've been trying to work with them. We got to do something now. I don't understand why we can't have a committee and let the volunteers have a say in it too. That's where all this is coming from. They don't have a say. Next thing they hear, this is what's happening. And that's the first thing they hear of it. I mean, how would each one of you feel? There's 7 of us sitting here. If 6 of us went to the side and decided everything, then all of a sudden we come in front of you, you had no say in it.
It's a good thing we're not allowed to do that, Todd. But
You can do one, you can do two at a time.
that's right. But the Fire and Rescue Commission, I think most of the board was confused on what the Fire and Rescue Commission was doing and if they weren't doing that to begin with.
This will be for personnel, not for equipment and stuff like that. This be to have somebody just so they can have a voice.
Well, I guess maybe we need to clarify or get some direction from what the Fire and Rescue Commission is. It is an advisory board made up of representation from each department, and anybody correct me if I'm not saying that correctly, or guide me if I misspeak, that a representative from both paid and our volunteers voted by a representative for them, so a captain or chief. Is that correct? Or their designee?
Their designee, yes.
Their designee, okay. So just like I represent District B, Ms. Biggs represents her district, we are the voice for that district. So if there are, I'm trying to understand where you're saying the volunteers don't have a voice, and we have volunteers here tonight that might, could answer that or speak to that if you're on the Fire and Rescue Commission for us, that if they don't feel that their chief or captain or designee are communicating with them, that's what we're here for.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that their chief or captain, whatever, is not communicating with them. What I'm saying, this committee would just be going towards working with the paid side.
To accomplish what?
So everybody be on the same page.
I think that's why we're having this meeting, this extended work session, to make sure we're asking these hard questions so that everybody's a team.
One night's not going to cure it.
I agree. One night is not. That's why it's going to be a future comprehensive plan that we need to address.
But isn't the Fire and Rescue Commission reviewing call data or not?
There's,
We get copied on it every month.
yeah, and we have the purpose of the commission as attached in the bylaws. And I'm wondering, Todd, if, so there's a subcommittee to deal with this or a subcommittee to deal with that. I'm wondering if what you're talking about could be a subcommittee of the Fire and Rescue Commission as it exists now, specifically to deal with interagency relationships.
I was wondering the same thing too, in a way, because you said you had a CIP committee, right? There's a committee that deals with that, so could there be a committee that could deal with more of the personnel? Like,
Yeah, I mean, are we thinking about relationships, chain of command, who's in charge on a scene, maybe establishing some parameters for how all agencies operate? You guys made mention of mutual aid agreements, maybe some clarification or codifying what does a mutual aid agreement mean and who would be the principal on command at a scene, and why, and how do we establish that hierarchy?
As well as, the decision to put a paramedic in Reiner seemed pretty unilateral to me, whether it was or not. And I think that there has to be some parameter or something around speaking to when the county is going to make a unilateral decision. Because clearly that you did. And I think our county was better for it. Personally, at least that's the way it sounds to me. But it doesn't mean that the other people are just waiting for the county to do it again somewhere else about something different. And they're not going to have anything to say. I have no idea, but that's kind of the way that I'm interpreting what you said.
The staff didn't make a unilateral decision. The staff brought information to the Board of Supervisors and presented the call data both times that we showed the call data to see if you determined there was a need to provide additional paid staff. The first time it was with the Charlottesville Rescue Squad, and then during this past budget cycle and a few months before that off cycle, we recognized that Reiner needed some help. Christiansburg couldn't keep responding to the second due calls. So we brought you the data, we let you decide. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody understood that it was not a staff decision to do that. We brought it to the board, and it was unanimously approved to provide that funding and that staffing.
And I'm willing to take that responsibility. I appreciate the clarification because I'm sure I was here when the vote happened and the discussion happened. So I think it's important that we have, it's important for the volunteers to understand why we feel like we need to step in.
And I believe, as we said earlier, there were discussions when the whole situation began with Charlottesville Rescue, with the rescue squad, to discuss the need to respond to calls and whether or not they would be able to get additional volunteers.
Well, that's a very good point, because I was remembering back when Supervisor Fidjakowski mentioned those discussions. We had at least 2 meetings before we ever even talked about paid staff, just to try to ascertain what was going on with their volunteer support in Charlottesville. So, that's where I get really concerned. I understand the perception of things sometimes and how we need to do a better job of making sure that's communicated too. But if I sound like a broken record tonight, I'm sorry, but there's not been any conscious effort by anybody in county administration or anywhere else to push volunteers out and put paid staff in. It's always been to support the operations that are in place.
And supervisors are the same way.
Well, and when we've seen issues of concern, we've brought that to the board, and the way it comes to the board is through appropriations, usually to provide funding to address those things that we've identified as concerns, and the board has supported that. So, candidly, that's been a concern at times with staff as well, as we absolutely want to make sure that we're lockstep with the board on what we're trying to do to provide the services we think you're telling us that we need to be providing.
Talking about policy, I know that the Fire and Rescue Commission, they have their bylaws, correct? And then we have an emergency response plan, countywide. I might not call that the right thing. Is that what it's called? Medical service response plan.
Emergency response plan.
And do we have set policies? Or is that something we need to look at? Do we have an understanding of agreement of, again, I'm not an expert, so protocol and to help maybe, I think Mr. King's trying to get at, we need to make sure that everyone is communicating together, working together. But I do have a concern with if we're going to get, because if we do a committee has, a committee or citizens do not have control over our paid personnel staff. So I do have a concern about, I'm all for if we need to do things for better communication, to develop relationships, strong relationships that we're all on the same team. I'm all for that. I would have a problem if all of a sudden there's a committee that starts saying things about paid employees, county employees, because that's not appropriate. That's an HR, that type of thing. So I do have concerns, and maybe that's not your intention of that, but I could see where there could be, maybe I'm the only one thinking that, but I could see where there could be definitely problems.
I definitely don't want to minimize the volunteers' expertise that they have that comes to the table whenever decisions are made. That it's really important. I mean, we all, like us as supervisors, have no say over our professional staff, So I think that's understood. But I think the volunteer leadership would have a lot of great ideas on communication and how to better work together and stuff like that, if it's not working.
So during this process, what has been the process to include volunteers in, sort of what's happening? Has there been a process or?
The two agencies that I think have been most directly affected with paid first responders so far is number one, Shawsville, before they voted to dissolve. And I think we've shared tonight, there were multiple meetings with the leadership of Shawsville Rescue making attempts to address that, talking about paid service. I know Supervisor Fidzikowski, I know you mentioned a meeting that you and Michael went to with their board of directors to talk about issues. So there's been multiple attempts on that front. When we began to have some challenges in Reiner with response, we had multiple meetings with the former chief, Chief Havens. I met with him on 2 occasions. I know Angie met with him a couple more than that.
4 or 5 times. I met with him 4 or 5 times.
Michael and Brandon and Tyler are out in the field and had conversations with the leadership in Reiner. So there's not I won't call it a formal structure, but I feel extremely confident that our staff has done everything they can to communicate concerns, try to identify areas to address, and try to work to get those addressed. In the situation in Shawsville, again, because of lack of volunteerism, lack of available volunteers, they voted to dissolve. And then in Reiner, unfortunately, there were some challenges with leadership, and I think that has been resolved. I see Jason Root back here tonight. Jason, thank you for stepping up for Reiner and helping them out. You guys see it every day. I feel very confident from what I see in here that we've repeatedly reached out to leadership in those squads when we've had issues and concerns.
Can I just ask one question? Do we document that communication and make it available for that squad to see, or?
We have, well,
Many of those things have been through email as well.
that's true. That's, yeah, a
Sent,
lot.
response plans and different correspondence through email, and ask that it be disseminated with the staff. That's a fine line to cross over, because we do want to respect the chief of that volunteer agency, and we don't really want to be communicating to their staff directly. We feel like that we want to respect them as the chief and work with them and have them communicate that back. And so I personally don't want to step over that line, because I understand that they are the chief and they are responsible for their agency. So we want to try to communicate with them and have them communicate with their folks. And we've asked, very early on, we said, we'd like to set up the model to where if our responder and a volunteer responder are on a call and there's some type of issue, if it's our staff that's having an issue, bring it back to Michael, and Michael will go to that chief. If it's their staff that's having an issue, go to their chief, and he can bring that to Michael. And so we've communicated, we like to have things work that way, so that we don't have a volunteer person coming to Michael or a career person going to a volunteer chief and crossing those boundaries. We'd like to have them work through that chain of command back up, and then try to find a solution to whatever the issue is. So we've done that, at least we've requested that in the past. So that's kind of been some of the communication that we've had.
Thank you.
Supervisor DeMonts?
I have a couple of follow-up questions on that. One, just for clarification, as a lifetime civilian, does the hierarchy operate similar to, is it paramilitary, similar to like a police department? Okay, that helps. Are there any very straightforward standards that have been given to volunteers or professional, like this is the average response time that we expect if, if we aren't able to get a response, say this board says we want a first responder on scene within 8 minutes. And I understand it's not as simple as that. That's dressing down. But are there any standards like that that could help provide guidance in the event that another rescue squad is needing help or maybe not answering the calls as quickly? Would something like that be helpful if we had policies?
So there are a few different answers to that question. I'll start by saying each department across the county has their own set of operating procedures that vary depending whether it's an urban area, whether it's a rural area. There's a lot that goes into that. So it's different across the county and across departments. We have our own set of policies and procedures as well that we follow. And then outside of that, there are national standards. The NFPA provides a lot of those standards that anyone can go and research as to nationally what is acceptable. Now, we try and obviously meet those standards because they've been set by folks that have a whole lot more expertise than I may. But on the EMS side, we do have an emergency medical services response plan that outlines what's expected of each agency, whether they're paid or volunteer, that we analyze constantly. And that sets response standards. It sets how quickly you would like them to get out of the station when they're dispatched to a call. And that's something that was adopted by all of the rescue chiefs in the county. So it's something that we reference. It's something that we have referenced with both Shawsville and Reiner to determine that they were in need of additional support. On the fire side of things, we don't have a fire type response plan that's like that. But Bonnie Rutherford, she works in our office, and she actually records every single call that comes from the 911 center, whether it be fire or EMS. And she gets those numbers so that we can go back and reference and say, all right, for the month of January, what did this particular agency look like? So we have that data that we can go back and reference. But on the EMS side, we have a standard that we can compare it to, where on the fire side, we don't necessarily have something like that.
That's helpful, and I appreciate kind of more detail on that. This is not a standard that's at all enforceable, but Vice Chair Biggs mentioned equity, and I know as a citizen of the town of Blacksburg, I live less than a mile from Blacksburg Volunteer Rescue Service. So my, and I've consciously made a decision based on things like access to rescue, access to water, schools. That's why I've decided to buy that house. But a standard of equity just county-wide for, this is what you can expect. I know that's going to be very different for me living in a much more densely populated environment than it would be, say, for Supervisor Fidzikowski. And how do we adopt a standard of equity, or what do we help communicate to not only the professional staff but our volunteer staff on, what is it that we expect in terms of response times and service to our citizens? I think that's some homework for this board to offer some clarification, because I'm fully in support of answering all calls. This idea of waiting for a second due makes me a little uncomfortable, because that's minutes that we're not in a response to a citizen that's in a crisis. But I think we have some homework to do to own what has happened that may have hurt feelings or caused discontent in Reiner. We need to fix that. And then also establishing as I hear Supervisor King asking, and I might be way off on what you're saying, but establishing a standard for how our agencies interact with each other when they're on a call that's predictable. So there isn't confusion, so there isn't jostling for leadership. So when people are on a call, you get to the scene and everybody knows the standard of what it is that we're supposed to do there. Am I hearing? But am I hearing, I thought I was also hearing that maybe you wanted something like that too, or something that helps us not have conflict among volunteers and professional because we know what to expect.
Or a way that they can communicate whatever it is that might be a concern or issue is what I think you were trying to, that's what would happen, I guess, with that committee. But what you're saying, I mean, that would lead to the, the good interaction and the team building, hopefully.
Can I add just a little bit? Or
Yeah, I'm done. I think I'm done.
So did I hear you correctly that the chiefs already have those standard sets for each of their organizations?
So not necessarily the chief per se, but
or at least
the
it is
departments
for-
themselves
yeah,
have come up
have
with
that.
standards that are agreed upon that they follow. And Supervisor DeMott's kind of to your point, there's some unwritten rules there too. When you talk about that hierarchy, I think it's generally accepted that if one department's going into another department's first due, that they're going to follow the guidance of whoever is in charge of that scene. I know across the county we have really robust and really successful mutual aid policies that whether it be Blacksburg responding into Christiansburg, they're going to work really well together because they know when they get there that they're going to abide by what that fire officer, what that EMS officer is asking them to do. I think there's a lot of mutual respect, whether it be career or volunteer, that we all have this unwritten understanding that we're going to respect who's in charge and follow their command per se.
Don't get me wrong, I think having a standard for each organization is probably a really good idea, but my sense is there's lots of reasons why each group has the goals that they have. And is there a sense that the goals are too low or too high, or they just need to be tweaked, or if they have the goal, are they not meeting the goal? I'm not quite sure where the gap is.
The big thing that I'm going to speak on the EMS side because that's really what we've been focused on. The big thing that you don't want to have happen is an agency continually having to turn over their call to the second due. And that's what we had happening in Shawsville. Christiansburg was continuously answering almost every call below the mountain, particularly during the day, and then it went to the night. And you start seeing that's really what the response plan, Michael talks about some standards in there. There are standards set forth percentage of calls that you respond to. And when you drop below that for consecutive months, then we have to make that communication to them and notify them that, hey, you're below the 75 or the 50%. That's a problem because that's where ambulance are coming from Christiansburg, or in some cases it was Blacksburg, responding to a citizen who's called 911 and asking for help for whatever it is. And that's what we don't want. We want to avoid. And so that's why that standard's there.
Have all the organizations agreed to that standard?
They've all signed on to it,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
Well, and that's something that we've talked about as well. We have the mutual aid agreements. There is an understanding. We've also been talking about, and this actually came out of the Fire Program Board study too, of what's called a memorandum of agreement between various agencies in the county on how certain things will be addressed and done, just to ensure that there's an equitable standard across the board. And we can talk about that at any point. I know Marty has done a lot of work on that. Appreciate your help with looking at that.
Michael, just to make sure I'm clear, and this goes along with Supervisor DeMott's, there are operating procedures, but every agency or department has a different operating procedure?
I probably shouldn't answer that. I'm sure there are probably some folks in this room that could give a better explanation to that, since we do have representation here from various departments across the county that I don't want to put words in their mouths.
Okay. Sir?
I think a lot of what you're asking is, like Jason can answer.
Oh, come on to the.
Come on up. If you stand up, you get to come on down.
Forrest Red, Christiansburg Fire Department Deputy Chief. I think a lot of the questions, like the response times, like we have a standard at 5 minutes. They ask who's coming and if you need second due. Jason can probably answer most of those questions, like the timeline and then the additional time for it, like afterwards. As far as what else were we talking about? Like most of the questions you're asking, I think a lot out here can give you the answers. They're giving you the right information, but we can add to it if you.
You guys
I
are
think
the
a lot of them
boots on the
doesn't know,
ground
like,
every day.
Yeah, they're not sure whether to speak up or not.
So Forrest, on the, maybe, I don't know if you can answer it. So is there a different operating, and if there is there a way that we could do standard, and that way it might cut down on some of the miscommunication, or who's in charge, or that type of thing?
Yeah, so like every department has a ranking, like officers are ranked. So usually whoever the highest ranking officer is on scene is who's in charge. For Christiansburg, we have call nights. So like one night it might be a captain or a lieutenant. That's who's in charge of that scene. Now if it's a structure fire and they don't feel comfortable, they'll relinquish it to a higher officer. So I think every standard is the same for every department.
So there is a standard.
Yes. So if you come to Christiansburg, you're going to, say Chief Yop's in charge, he's going to run the scene. So if mutual, or let's say the county sends an ambulance over, that's who he might say, I need you to do rehab.
So the jurisdiction first due,
Yes.
they will have, I don't know, command,
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sorry? Operational control. But what if it's a first due and they can't get there first due, second due is first on the scene?
Then whoever the highest officer is there would
For
be.
the second due people? And is there any
The reason
difference?
that is because they're there before anybody else.
Okay. And
So
they
would run the scene until, if a first due comes, they would ask them, but like if Blacksburg happens to beat us to a call in Christiansburg, Blacksburg's probably going to run it until the Christiansburg person comes up to date or up to speed with what's going on.
Okay. And all departments have that same understanding, and there's
Yes.
not been an issue?
Not with our side, but we don't run as much with McFims as, say, Reiner and Chief Duncan can probably come to that a little more.
And is there a difference for the emergency responders? If you can, you're for the fire department, right, Forrest?
Yeah, Christiansburg.
Okay, good, yes.
So.
Zach Duncan, Chief of Reiner Fire Department. We've had pretty good here lately, working with McFims. Usually, when we have a structure fire or something, we're second due with Christiansburg, or they're second due for us. And we'll take over the scene, and if they're there, first thing they do is come ask us, what do you need? Same thing when we do it with them. It's just a collective bargaining once we get there. So usually we don't have any issues on our side. We don't have any issues on our side that I know of, as of now. We run everything pretty well.
And that's Reiner Fire Department.
Reiner Fire Department. Yep.
Okay. Supervisors have any follow-up for the gentleman?
I wonder if we have anybody from an EMS agency
Yeah, I'd like to hear
that
that
might
too.
want to talk about
Yeah.
working with McFims.
Dave, you should have gone back and sat on the other side.
Thank you, gentlemen.
But that's really good, because that's what I was sort of trying to ask, like what happens when you have a
Yeah,
scene?
it sounds like
So that
yeah.
really helped me. Okay.
So I think I understand the question. Dave English, I'm the chief of Blacksburg Rescue. I'm now a full-time career position, but 100% of our responders are volunteer, and I still kind of volunteer too. So basically what happens is if it is a large scene where both agencies are going to be there, like let's say just the other day we had a big car accident and multiple victims. Maybe we've got 2 or 3 ambulances, but we need another. So Virginia Tech might send a truck, or if Montgomery County's got a truck close, maybe they'll send one. Typically, whatever the primary jurisdiction is, if both agencies are there, then that primary jurisdiction kind of has control, similar to what the fire department was saying. If we are calling them because we don't have a truck, maybe all of our trucks are already out on other calls, and we mutual aid that. Typically for us, it's going to be Virginia Tech Rescue just because they're kind of the next closest. They would come, they would run that and kind of be in charge of that incident for themselves, if that makes sense. But we've regularly worked together with the other jurisdictions, other agencies. We train together. Brandon and Tyler and Michael are probably at our station at least once a week, and a lot of our volunteers actually work for them as well. So, kind of an important point when they were starting that up is almost, if not all of the volunteer or all of the employees also had a background in volunteer EMS or fire. So we really haven't run into any issues as far as them showing up and kind of arguing over who's in charge. It's usually based on the location.
Have you had a problem with the volunteers transitioning to the career so you don't have as many volunteers?
We haven't. I don't think any of our volunteers that do this as a career have left us. If anything, the new schedule actually allows them to volunteer more with us. But we've got several, I don't want to give a number, but probably at least 8 to 10 of our volunteers that also work for Montgomery County Fire and EMS. And I don't believe we've lost any of them since it started up.
Interesting.
Dave, you said about jurisdiction. Does that matter too if you're doing an EMS call and someone's an EMT versus a paramedic?
Not typically. Basically, it kind of falls back to the level of care that the patient needs. So, we don't always send a paramedic on every call. We typically always have one available, but we do triage that based on the information we get from dispatch and, other various factors. But basically, we'll either send a paramedic right away, we'll send a BLS truck, which is basic life support, so with an EMT, and then have a paramedic either go meet them there in case they're needed, or if it sounds like a really low acuity call, somebody stubbed their toe a week ago, because we do get calls for things like that, there's really no need to tie up that limited resource of that paramedic. We would rather keep them available for when the next person is having a heart attack. We don't want them tied up on that low acuity call. So we are a little more dynamic in how we deploy that just because we have the capacity to do that versus having the paramedic tied to the truck and they're going on every call no matter what. So that's kind of how we handle it.
So the paramedic is the highest, is it before pre-hospital?
Other than doctors, yeah.
The doctors. Do all of our agencies have paramedics?
Do any not? There's definitely some agencies that are limited on paramedics. I don't want to speak for other agencies for sure. I think most have at least access to some paramedic coverage. I would say most probably don't have it, or not all of them have it all of the time.
So paramedics are not available all the time for all the agencies?
Yes, I would think so.
Does that sound right to anybody else in the audience? Does that sound correct? Come on up.
Come on up.
My name is Jake Brewer. I'm the chief of Virginia Tech Rescue. I would say that's a fair assumption, but the mutual aid procedures in this county help us to get paramedics from other places to other agencies very frequently. We offer 24/7 ALS coverage to the community. We're happy to do that for anybody who requires it. We've gotten help from Blacksburg in previous years. We've helped them out. Christiansburg has helped us out. On the EMS side of things, including with McPhemus, we have a great community where we're able to help each other out when needed and pretty much cover any type of incident.
Excellent. Thank you. Supervisor Bone?
Um,
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. It's always great to hear from Blacksburg people, but I'd like to hear from the other organizations on the EMS side.
I had one question for the
Supervisor Shepherd?
chief for Blacksburg Rescue.
Yes.
And I've seen this happen. I'm asking the question just for the rest of the board's information, more or less. You said that you send the paramedic when it's necessary or when they're needed.
Yes.
Does that paramedic have a designated vehicle that they use, or they just go with the rescue squad when they need?
Yeah, a little of both. So we have, we'll have a paramedic staffed at our station for the most part, or if they're not going to be at the building, then they would be out in a response vehicle. We do have a response vehicle that's designated for that level of care. And so, when a emergency call comes in, if it's something very serious, like, someone's having a heart attack or a cardiac arrest, they're just going to hop right on the ambulance because they're definitely going to be needed. Right. And so they would just go with the ambulance. But otherwise, yes, they would be in a response vehicle so that they could go meet the ambulance there, or they could go assist a different place or a different agency potentially as well.
Yeah, I've seen that happen where there's a call and they don't have ALS and they require it, then they'll show up in a separate vehicle. Anyway.
Yeah, because the dispatchers are only as good as the information they receive, and a lot of times it's really good information, but sometimes they don't get the full picture, and so it's not uncommon for us to get there and realize that it's either better or worse than what was originally told, and then so we have that flexibility. We can call for a medic if we need one, or if one is there and they end up not being needed, they can free up so that they're available for something else.
Right. That's all. Thank you.
No.
I'm Steve Schuler, Longshot McCoy, Rescue Chief. And to go along with what Dave and Jake was saying, we have 4 paramedics on our roster, but we also have 4 or 5 advanced EMTs. And advanced EMT in a rural setting can handle almost 90% of the calls. So all of my medics are career medics somewhere else, so I can't count on them being there at a certain time, but Blacksburg Rescue has always, been able to send me a medic if I don't have one, and it's worked pretty seamlessly because your advanced and your BLS people can always start the call and get it ready, and the old saying was, how was it? Paramedics save lives, but EMTs save paramedics. So the EMTs are getting things ready for them. So it's worked pretty seamlessly at Longshot.
Thank you. Anybody? Follow up? Anybody? Thank you, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Any further questions on this? So it sounds like that if I'm correct, it sounds like if agencies do not have a paramedic, between mutual aid or the paid staff, it's covered. Does that sound pretty good? And is it a challenge to, well, I guess is a challenge, that's why we're here, but I said with paramedics, do you have more EMTs than you do paramedics? And obviously, I think I just already know the answer to that.
Yeah, I think for the most part, yes. I think Michael may have the actual numbers if you need those, but overall, like for Blacksburg specifically, we've got roughly 150 total volunteers, and I think maybe 22-ish of those are paramedics. That said, kind of like what Steve mentioned, most of the calls we run don't actually require that level of service. Now, I do think that it's important to have that level of service available because you can't pick and choose when something like that is going to happen. But I think the vast majority of our calls can and are handled at the EMT or the advanced EMT level. It's really just that, kind of limited, maybe 10% of the calls that we go on that are really that high acuity situation that needs that next level of care.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So, not necessarily for both of you, but it seems to me that the board here given the information that we got, we may have made the right decision, but maybe it wasn't communicated well to get, I don't know. So if ever anybody has any issue or wants us to do something different, you got to tell us, because we're only as, we're clearly not as educated in this topic as we would like to be to support our volunteers. I'm happy to apologize for making a mistake if there was a mistake. But we need your help to make sure that we're not doing stupid things, I don't think we're doing stupid things, but we certainly don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. We certainly want to keep the response rate up great, and we want to make sure that we're all working together.
Well, I certainly don't. I'll speak to that.
Maybe I'm not even saying things properly, but
Well, we definitely haven't done anything stupid. I can assure you of that. Communication's always something that can be improved and worked on. I think our folks do an exceptional job. I've said this in lots of meetings as well. I am so pleased and proud that Michael Gary's leading this effort for the county. I know what his heart is for service, and I know when you have a staff, any of you guys that are involved with volunteer departments, you have volunteers that say all kinds of stuff, just like I'm sure some of our paid staff some days have maybe said something that it's like, no, that is not what that meant. Bottom line is, I have not had one citizen come to me and say, we think you made a mistake at the county by moving forward with this effort. Nuances and concerns about how things are communicated sometimes, sure. Again, going back to the conversations with other county administrators that have been somewhere on this journey from either all volunteer to all paid, anywhere along the way there are challenges and frustrations and concerns, but I think we've been very fortunate with the group that we've hired so far to work together. What I've told volunteers when things come up about, well, somebody may have said this or that, take it to Mr. Gary, because if there's a paid staff person out there that's got a concern that he needs to be aware of, make them aware of it. I appreciate your comments, but I think for the most part, this is going, and I've heard from other county administrators that I've talked with about where we are in all this. They say, yeah, it's hard, but it sounds like y'all are doing exceptionally well.
I guess also I'd like to say is it's important for people, the people in Reinard to be talking to Supervisor King, but don't hesitate to reach out to the rest of us too, because that will help us all understand what you're looking for. I think several of us are still struggling with what Supervisor King is really trying to get at. No question that we want to help. We just don't know how to do it, you know. We want to make sure that creating another subcommittee makes sense or what have you. So any kind of insight is greatly appreciated.
Well, I would think of that. I'm sorry. Did you want to come forward, sir?
I'm Mike King, and I know Chief Duncan talked a minute ago, but got a few things I'd like to say that maybe he hadn't heard around the firehouse. You know, when y'all started all this, it was good. But then it was started out to be a rescue squad. Then you brought in the fireside. That created turmoil. Rightfully so, because everybody said, oh, now they done changed their mind. It's not like that yet. And we're thankful for that. But we get that settled down. And rescue says, you know what, we need help. We can't do our calls in the middle of the day. That's good. Next thing you know, looking from our side, they come to, y'all have the paid people in there. One day we go help them run a call because they needed some assistance. Don't mind helping, we love helping. That's why we're here. We get a remark, well, here for long, we're going to get a rescue truck and we won't need y'all anymore. Okay. So, whatever. Everybody settles down. Well, next thing you know, the county comes to us and says, look, we don't have a place to put our paid paramedic personnel in Reiner. Whatever the issue was going on there. So, reluctantly, we told them, yeah, go ahead. You can leave them here for a couple of weeks. And they assured us that's how long it was going to take. Well, and we told them, we said, look, we're not sprinklers. You can't sleep here. Oh, they're not going to sleep. Well, and they may have told the prior chief. I don't know what they told him. Next thing you know, we come in the firehouse, there's a bed in our day room where everybody's been sleeping. So that makes the volunteers say, well, they're not being truthful about that. Then, you know, next thing you know, we send our people to classes. We've got McPhil's people in classes, which is fine, whatever. These people tell ours that, hey, we're getting ready for the future. It won't be long, and we're going to start easing over into y'all's way. Okay. So, you know, how are we as volunteers without, you know, some sort of communication to know that's not what's happening? You know, to some of us, I know Zach probably don't hear it. It's just like any other job. The head person don't know everything, but when you get farther on down the line, people will talk to you. And maybe I've heard more than Zach. I don't know. But it's little things like that that has happened from the start of McPhil's. And I agree, we need something to make sure everybody's safe. But at the same time, we need to go about it right. And we need to make sure that everybody, if it's, they make changes in the McPhil's, maybe come out to our meeting and say, look, especially out Reiner, because we seem to be affected by it more than most right now. Maybe come out and tell us, you know, hey, look, guys, this is what we're going to do. We don't want y'all to hear this from, you know, Joe Blow down the street that we're going to do this, and next thing you know, we're going to take this. You know, if you're not doing that, that's fine, great. We don't want you to. But we need to know something, because it gets aggravating every time you turn around, somebody's saying something different. You know, and maybe if we had an advisory board, maybe they would say, hey, all right, this is what's going on. We're going to have these meetings and let everybody know you're more than welcome to come. It's just something to get more communication out there, because it gets aggravating and we're starting to lose members as far as interest. Everybody's still running calls, but I've got guys that when they go to a class and they're telling them, hey, man, we're getting ready to take y'all's job. So how am I supposed to tell that guy, no, don't worry about it. Just keep taking your classes for what, another year? You don't want to waste his time. But that's the kind of struggle that we have. And
I mean, we're gonna run our calls. That's a given. Until y'all tell us we can't run calls anymore. Rhino Fire Department's gonna run calls. But we need a little help. I mean, with these rumors and everything else.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
Who picks the leadership of Rhino Fire Department?
We do, but I do know that everything doesn't go through him that McFims is getting ready to do.
Well, it would be quite a challenge for county staff to talk to every volunteer. Now, I'm not saying that we can't do some of that, but when my concern is, it's just like if there's an issue at the county. I talk to the department director of that department, and I expect that director to communicate that down to the employees. I feel confident that Michael has had conversations with the chief at Reiner, and I'm not trying to throw Zach under the bus. I'm just saying in terms of how things are communicated.
Right.
So to me, Mikey, it sounds like it's more of an internal issue within the department on how things are being communicated than it is a county issue of.
Maybe I didn't say it right. I understand what you're saying wholeheartedly, but at the same time, Zach can only tell us so much that he's been told. You know what I'm saying? And I'm not throwing Michael under the bus or bad mouthing him or anything like that, but they can run a call, have 2 or 3 of the emergency service guys on any structure fire. What is 30 minutes on one Thursday when we have our meetings. That way we get it straight from the horse's mouth and nothing can be disconstrued, or next time when that person from, whether it be volunteer or paid rescue, when they say, "No, this is what we're going to do." Well, why didn't Michael tell us that when he was out here? He didn't say nothing about that. I'm pretty sure he'd have probably told us.
Well, I've said this in a meeting before too. If any McFims staff person says something like that, Mr. Gary needs to be aware of that. Because that will, as I said to Reiner Rescue leadership, if he's made aware of that and he straightens it out, and then we have a meeting and we straighten it out, there's no need, it's done.
And I understand that, but what I'm saying is, it means more coming straight from the horse's mouth than just a man that's trying to make sure our collar is getting run, and he's doing his job. But it makes it hard on him or any other chief. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, sir.
Would a regular once a month, for the short term, kind of Michael going to your meetings or whatever, be helpful? How, what would you like?
I
what
think
can
it
we
would
do?
be helpful if, something, whenever they do a change, because if you look at it from our point of view, we don't get involved in rescue stuff. We don't. But when they decided to staff it 24 hours a day with an extra truck, think about how it looked from us. We had no information about what's going on. When they put that truck out there, they're running their night calls. But they still done that. I'm not saying anybody's doing anything wrong. What I'm saying is try and look at it from the volunteer's point of view.
More communication's better than less, is what you're
Correct.
saying too. Yeah. And getting it straight from.
I'm not trying to get involved in their stuff. It doesn't affect me. I don't run their calls. It doesn't affect me. But when you're looking at it from the volunteer's point of view, you got to kind of think when things is happening, look at our point of view too. And, like I say, we're going to continue to run calls until y'all tell us we can't anymore. But, it helps out. Because there's a lot of people that get discouraged. And there for a while, and it's getting a little better now, but there for a while, it seemed like every time we get one thing smoothed over, it'd be a whole another thing come up. And it's like, gosh, we just got this situated. And Zach will tell you, Zach's doing his job. I'm not throwing off on him a bit.
Yeah.
But, and like I say, there's stuff that I hear that he doesn't hear because he is the chief. I'm sure there's employees here at the county that won't tell you everything, but they may come to Miss Angie and say, "Hey, Miss Angie," and that's the way it works everywhere.
It's true.
I appreciate it.
Mikey, so what I'm hearing is there's a little bit of breakdown in communication or miscommunication. When you talk about the other truck and 24/7, you're talking about the Rhino rescue truck. Is that
Yes,
what you
ma'am.
mean? So several things that we need to do, in my view, is that, first of all, everything we've done on this board to approve 24/7 with this last budget for the Rhino to be out there 24/7, 365 days, that was open. I get it. People don't always watch the Board of Supervisors. All your friends are watching tonight probably. But other than that, you're probably not always watching. We want to make sure that that is communicated well in our Fire and Rescue Commission, because obviously that is where that needs to go to that leadership and come down. And I know sometimes it's like the telephone game. It trickles down and you might get wrong information or misinformation. So maybe on the county level, we can do something better, like in writing, if there's an update. And that would be a good way that we also know contact information and who our volunteers are, that we can directly from this board communicate with them, so that if there is a breakdown in questions, that you can reach out to leadership in the county, and then again, and with Michael. And then if there are, Mr. Meadows just said, if there are issues on the personnel paid side, we can't control what everybody says, or misinformation, or rumors, or gossip. But if there is something, a conflict on the personnel side, paid side, it needs to go directly to Michael, chain of command, or to Mr. Meadows here, and to be dealt with. And I can't control what people say in rumors, or even if I tell you I'm going to do A, B, and C, and you don't believe me, I'm telling you. First thing I will tell you, to make sure that every volunteer in here hears this correctly: this board, and board members, correct me if I'm wrong, we are not looking to replace or hire firefighters. Do you understand what that would cost this board? Sherry Blevins is not raising taxes to do away with firefighters. We are blessed to have the volunteers. Are there areas of improvement that we need? Absolutely. Our concern right now is making sure we have EMS providers and that they have the best service and response time. So correct me, anybody on this board, if that's your goal or intention. So you heard it right from the horse's mouth. We are not hiring paid firefighters. Our concern right now is with our emergency services and making sure that we have our citizens covered. That is the number one goal. So if there's a breakdown in leadership, we want to make sure everything's clear in the commission. Supervisor Fidzikowski's, he gave us reports to make sure that this board is updated. And if we need to find a system of where we can directly email our people, our volunteers, so that everyone has a clear communication, that's what I should suggest, unless board members have other suggestions. Mr. Meadows?
Thank you, I appreciate it. Well, I'll go ahead and clear this up. If there's anything that we can do on the volunteer side to help the board, we will be here in these meetings. I have no problem taking time to come out here. The communication for the past, I don't know however many months we've been doing this transition over, it's been pretty hard, especially for the volunteers. So, like you said, if we can just get that communication side a little bit better, I think we're going to be in a world that may look better than what it does now.
Thank you, Zach.
So,
I made a couple of notes too. I think there's some opportunities that would be fairly easy for us to make sure we're sending stuff out so that you guys can share it with your memberships. Just kind of a weekly update. There's several things I think we can address from a staff perspective that wouldn't be hard at all, that would really hopefully help knock some of that down.
now, I will tell you, myself and Gary do pretty well from here on out. We've had great communication lines. That's no problem. But the transition from once it started to where it is now has been a very big venture on the volunteer side, just like Mike was talking about. When I took over, this was the start of it. So it was a cascade effect. And all I can do is my job right now and try to fix it. So if there's anything that we can do, just let us know in Reiner, and we'll be glad to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Board?
I make a
Supervisor
motion that we
Demotte.
come out of work session.
Can I just make one comment?
Supervisor?
I can't thank you enough for all this input, and I'm sure there's other people that would be happy to speak, but for whatever reason don't want to speak tonight. We want to hear it. We want to help and support you, and thank you so much for taking your time and helping us get to a better place.
Supervisor Demotte, I did have another topic. Okay. Now that we are clear on communication and it looks like mutual aid is working well with everyone, I did want to go back to when we talked about capital and finances. I wanted to look at our policy to make sure that we're transparent with our citizens, accountability on financial audits from each department to make sure as we're giving money that we have accountability for that. Now, that was recommended by the Fire Services Board, and maybe Mr. Dave, you might be able to speak to that. I know your agency does do that.
Yes, we, at Blacksburg Rescue, we do a yearly audit. We bring in an external company to do that. I support it. I think it's a good thing. From my position, I love it because it makes it, I feel safer knowing that there's those checks and balances, so I'm not going to get accused of something. I've got someone completely independent that can come and review everything. I will say it's not cheap, so that's something to consider. For our agency, we pay, I think it's over $6,000 a year for that audit. So that is a consideration, and it is a time investment as well. So, moving forward for other agencies, that just might be something to factor
That's
in.
something the town of Blacksburg requires for both.
They do now,
Yeah,
yes. I think for a while it was just rescue. For the last several years, I know the fire department's also done it.
Do they audit all of your funds or just the funds from the town of Blacksburg or?
They audit everything other than the town of Blacksburg. Town of Blacksburg does their own audit that covers the town funds. Our audit covers the money that comes in from the county and donations and grants and everything else.
So the town funds don't pass to you, they just pay the invoices as they come due?
Yes, or they reimburse us.
Okay, thank you.
That means, I'm sorry, to make sure I understand, means the town is purchasing everything? Or
Yeah, we funnel purchases through the town, or if we purchase them ourselves, we have to submit it to the town and the town reimburses us.
So there's always checks and balance of what that.
Yeah, and then on their end, that's all obviously audited as the town's finance department.
And is that something that has to be, is that something that could be, and Christiansburg does the same, is that correct? Town of Christiansburg for rescue and fire? Okay. Is that something that I don't know if that's something the board can look at a policy or a fire rescue commission. Mr. Meadows, you can kind of guide us here, but I think that's very important that I was frankly surprised when we had the fire study that we don't require any type of financial audit. Trust, but always verify. This is taxpayers' money. We need to be accountable. It's good. It protects not only the citizens, the taxpayers, but like you mentioned, it protects the volunteers, and it protects the county from, any type of liability. And with the, in light of the recent events and, we want to be accountable for every tax dollar. And so I don't know if that's a policy that would be implemented, I guess, at the board level, because the Fire and Rescue Commission is only an advisory board.
Due to the late hour this evening, we do not have time to get into the discussion of any type of memorandum of agreement this evening, but one of the things is we've looked at the fire program board study and heard comments from board members and looked at how the other localities are doing things. We do feel that there probably needs to be some arrangements agreed upon between the county and the volunteer agencies that receive funding from the county to make sure everybody's on the same page. Again, it's not a distrust thing. It's a matter of, there's hundreds of thousands of dollars each year that this board's appropriating to various rescue and fire agencies, and just to ensure there's accountability. And as you said, I use that phrase all the time, trust but verify. Nobody distrusts anybody, but if somebody ever asks, we can say, that's not an issue. We've already got that addressed. Here it is.
And we do request that of our outside agencies that we fund. The other outside agencies do provide that kind of information to us already.
That would be important for us as making sure that we know just a financial audit, how the funds are spent, and so that our citizens have questions. It's very transparent.
I think that I'm comfortable with us moving forward with that. I think that we should provide supplemental funding to do it, because I don't think
I
that
agree
it's
with that as
appropriate.
well.
Right.
Staff totally agrees with
Yeah.
that.
But in addition to the funding, often, it's going to take more time now. So they'll need some resource to help them.
Yeah, and anything like that wouldn't be, oh, by the way, by the end of next month.
I know.
Yeah,
That would
no.
be horrible.
No, there would be a timetable. But we had already had that discussion. If we got to that point tonight, anything like that we're requiring from the fire and rescue agencies, I think the county should help supplement the cost of that. Curtis Witt from Christiansburg was raising his hand.
Curtis Witt, Deputy Fire Marshal, Town of Christiansburg. Just along the finance side, the Town of Christiansburg Fire and EMS, your funds are put in a special revenue account with the town. So all of our bills and invoices are actually coded, sent to the town, and then the town pays it out. Just kind of bring you up to speed on how we work.
Very good.
I
Thank
believe
you.
that's how
Definitely
Blacksburg.
pros and cons to the two approaches, which we can talk about at a different meeting, but and as I said, pros and cons to both sides, but if these agencies are talking about the invoices are run through the towns, so they're not, the volunteers are not the people that are having to go through the audit. They don't have to write the checks anymore. There are cons to that would not be the most beneficial to them. There are some drawbacks, but there are also some benefits as well. I think that needs to be weighed carefully, and I do think it would be a good idea to get their input about that.
And I just want to make sure that because this change will take their time, that it's not just the money, but maybe the county's finance department has some resources, people to help them actually.
We would bring that to you. I'm
Right.
not going to commit the current level of staffing
I
for the
agree.
finance department to do that, but we would figure
Right.
out how the county could support that, definitely.
Yes, thank you.
But we would still use a outside agency.
Oh, yes,
Now, is that something that we could contract for the remaining departments that don't have that now?
Yes, we
And get a
could.
better price for that?
We could add that on to the county's auditor's contract.
to do yeah.
Very good. And just as we were, because we talking about the future, strategic plans, is that something that the Fire and Rescue Commission talk about?
Strategic plan?
Or just for the plan for the future? Like when you do your capital improvement, are you looking 5 to 10 years out
That's just for equipment,
for equipment? Yeah.
yeah. And that's what that committee does. Am
You
I
all do
correct,
that?
Michael? No, we don't do that at the,
Fire and Rescue Commission?
it's voted on, but it's not decided.
Fire and Rescue Commission doesn't talk about facilities, in other
No,
words.
right, just talking about equipment, like.
Yes.
And we have a need this year, but in 5 years, that's what I'm saying, do we have a plan that kind of says in 5 years, we're gonna need this, in 10 years, we're gonna need?
Yes.
We do?
In case there's a shortfall of funds 5 years from now, not because of anything other than the demands of the capital.
Well, and the capital committee, the capital committee knows that there's the penny and a half that's coming into that fund each year. In some years, they may buy They may have carryover funds because they bought less, because they know next year or 2 years or 3 years, there's going to be a big purchase. So the capital committee does a really good job of managing that. What I've heard in recent weeks, and I think we agree with, is, that needs to be shared with you guys too. You need to understand, because those are tax dollars that you've appropriated for that use. And you've trusted, and they have done a good job of allocating those funds to the various departments, but there needs to be a better job of sharing that with the board.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. And I guess, what response do we have to the letter that we sent out with information, asking information on our
I'm looking at
agencies?
Michael and Brad on that, because I know that they've been coordinating the receipt of those.
And I guess, do all the volunteer agencies know the questions that the board was asking, so that they have a clear understanding of the information we were seeking?
We sent, I think the information that the board was seeking, I put together in a letter and sent out to everybody to request responses.
We've received a majority of that information from the departments across the county, but we don't have all of it yet.
To begin getting all of that to us soon, so we know our resources. We're just thinking about the future, and not only thinking about for the county needs, but as we do regional responses, making sure we know our resources, making sure we know, what training and assets we have, where we lack, what we might need to invest in, what we might need to, recruit more, what do we need to do? I did hear from a couple of volunteers that sometimes training is only offered on weekdays, and they need it on weekends, those type of things to help with recruitment. So this would be a good opportunity that we have that data, so that we know what our resources are, and then when we go these regional approaches, that we know what the county has to offer regionally as well, that we can offer. So we're working on collecting all of that information. Okay, all right.
If vehicles were on there, Brad sent us that.
Yeah, we have the vehicles, just the
Yeah, the
training.
vehicles, right.
I guess really is the responders, how many first responders, volunteers that we have are active, what type of training they have, what type of expertise that we would. Someone had mentioned that years ago, a former Mr. Neil Turner had had an idea of everybody having a card, so when you showed up on scene, you know what type of training you had and response, and that way we could best utilize that experience or expertise, and that would be a good way to track it. So we'll get that. Okay, thank you.
Well, I'm all about training. I think people need to train. I really do. But training cannot cap experience. People has experience, and I'm not knocking training. Like I said, I like training. I'd like to do training myself. But we also have to look at the experience that's in this county. They may not have a piece of paper that says, well, I'm experienced in this, but they have the experience.
Is there something like in-house training that they would get credit or that would count towards that?
I'm just talking about the experience. I mean, the other night you seen how many people come here and got them awards, 40, 20 years and all this. Experience counts for something. These men and women spend a lot of time volunteer. We can't just sit here and say, you got to get trained in this, you got to be trained in that. You have to count the experience.
I'm not discounting that or arguing that, but on a liability issue, Mr. Marty, there be a liability issue?
Well, I mean, you want the people who are fighting fires or doing EMS, they have to be trained, right, to do the job. So, I mean, and we, as the county who's in charge of fire and rescue response overall, we need to ensure that that is the case. So.
Are you I don't want to take this the wrong way. Are Mr. King, are you saying that we have volunteers that are not trained or don't have any training?
No, I'm not saying that whatsoever. I'm just saying.
Okay, because you
Don't-
had me very worried at that
No,
point.
What I'm saying is, don't overlook experience.
No.
I mean, me as a young man, I got almost 20 years experience. And I know some of these other, I mean, they know what they're doing. We just cannot focus on a certificate.
Well, Michael, I heard you say training was part of the ISO rating. Do they accept experience?
I'm going to try and speak to this without any personal opinions. Training is a big piece of the ISO rating. And in that sense, experience is not looked at. If something were to happen, they would be pulling training records to see what level those responders are trained to. Not saying that experience doesn't mean anything, because it does, but from an ISO perspective, they're looking at documented paper certificates.
Okay.
Is there, I'm sure I already know this answer. There is a minimum requirement that all agencies require, and you are keeping up with that information. I'm correct with that. I see heads saying yes. Okay. So it is a requirement. Okay. So we will be gathering that because we will be able to have that, and it is a requirement. That's good. Sir? Come on up, Forrest.
Yeah, Curtis can probably tell us a little more, but for like the ISO training, if the fire department logs like driver training, so if you're returning from a call, we log who's driving that truck. That counts as driver training for ISO. And we started because we got faulted on logging our training in Christiansburg. So by us logging who's driving, so when they return from a call, they get driver training for however long they were on that truck.
They get credit.
Yes.
Okay.
So that is a type of training that isn't on their record, but it's training that helps the insurance later on, if that makes sense.
And we're keeping records of that.
We are.
Good.
I'm not saying every department in the county is, but we learned that.
The hard way.
That's what kept us from getting a lower ranking in Christiansburg on our ISO, because we didn't have training records. We had all our training records for our members, but we didn't log like driver training, which is required not only for ISO, but it's also required for our insurance.
And that
If that makes sense.
That speaks directly to experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, giving credit for experience.
Yeah.
Right. I think
So
that's
like
excellent.
most people that drive have EVOC through either the state or rescue. So, but driving, and we log it, it helps.
Right, and that's for accountability to know, I think one of the questions that we, for the board, was making sure that for accountability that we have training. Are there reports, incidents? I know that they were explaining to me, you pull everything off the CAD and incident reports. But, we had a question like, if we don't know who all our volunteers are and there is a injury and we're the board, the county's paying for insurance, how do you know that how do you know that person was on that accident or incident if there's not a report? And I don't know that you can pull the personnel that responded. Can you pull the personnel that responded?
Yes, ma'am. Through the reporting system that we use, we can track man hours. We can track everybody that was on the scene, what vehicle they were in, or if they were at the station. We also track, going back to the experience, we also track in-house training hours. So you might not get a certificate for, a 2-hour education class in-house, but we're tracking that in-house. We have that ability. I can't speak for the other departments in the county.
Okay.
And I think that, circling back to what Michael said earlier, I think when he's talking, yes, experience counts. It's got to be documented, because when ISO comes in and take a look, if those records are there, looks like we got a barbershop quartet going now. Come on up.
So in Reiner too, we do the same thing. We keep track of our records. All right, so We have a training, I have my training guys back there. It's a nice program now. We keep it all logged. What it does is it helps us, if we have in-house training, it makes it 10 times easier. We don't have to go to a class. We're teaching our guys exactly what they need to know. This is how we fight fires. We don't always fight fires the same way Longshop or Christiansburg or Blacksburg fight a fire. It just depends. It depends on what the call is too. So we try to keep up with all of our training records and make sure that, yes, the county is being taken care of with good trained firemen and EMS. So I will tell you that. That's our goal, definitely in Reiner, and I will probably speak for everybody else that they do similar to the same things.
Okay.
Ryan Zikes, Assistant Chief, Reiner Fire. I don't want to talk for Todd or Supervisor King, but I think what he was saying with experience was the training that we are turning in are all certified trainings is what they're requesting. So what they're not looking at or what the board's not going to see is all the experience that goes behind that. We have 2 training days a month that we do, if not more. So I think that's what the county was requesting was all of our certified trainings, firefighter 1, firefighter 2, hazmats, but that's not all of our in-house trainings that we put our time into. And
As you guys respond, please add that in terms of making sure we get the big picture. I understand the reasons for asking for those specifics, because those are things that we've understood you have to be able to check boxes, but that piece needs to be brought to the board's attention too.
Absolutely. So yeah, that's what we're talking. I said in-house training. We need to know that and keep records of that. And yes, experience is a key.
Well, there's we could do it in the county side if you wanted to, but each department keeps up with their own training records too. I mean, if you want that, you are going to have stacks and stacks and stacks of all kinds of training records. If you want that, we are more than welcome to do that. But we also have it in-house, and I'll probably, Christiansburg, do you guys keep y'all's in-house? Okay. So most departments keep everything in-house, just like our bylaws, same thing. We just keep everything in-house. So
Everything's on paper?
most of it. Now, we had talked about that too. Fire programs, if you want to talk about that.
Yes, we
nice
did.
little booklet they gave y'all, which is great and all. But fire programs is not the best situation to get your training records. It is very hard to get everything to loop in. They had one program and now they have another. So everything doesn't line up. It's not stars and everything else. It doesn't work that way all the time. So whatever y'all need, we'll be glad to get. But we do our own in-house training and our experiences with our own firemen. So
I'd hate to make you guys do any more work than you're doing already. So if there's ways that, we can get a contractor to help get the information from you, put it in whatever report form that we need, that kind of stuff. However, we can help the whole situation and limit the amount of extra work that you have to do, I'm all for.
So now we have a new system. It's ESO. So everything is getting put into that system. So now it's going to be instead of a paper copy, we'll have it online. It's just taken us a lot of time to get to that. We can't do that every day. Now, if we were different, then we can't. But we will. We're working on it now. So I will say probably everybody else is too. But thank you.
Very good. Okay. Board members? Anything? Supervisor DeMont?
Do we have any other topics to cover?
I think we've made a great progress for the board and on the staff side. Have we given you some guidance of some questions just to kind of go over? So we will look at some for a later time. We will look into the financial audits for transparency and accountability. We will better communicate and send out once we get all the information. And we didn't ask for emails, but I guess if we can compile some type of way to reach people, our volunteers, so that the message is communicated clearly for communication. I think you've working with the Fire and Rescue Commission that answers our questions a little bit on, we're going to bring forward presentations whenever we're going to do appropriations or recommendations for big budget items like that. And it sounds like a lot of our communication, I know we were all talking, you guys had came up a little bit, but it sounds like communications is that mutual aid is working between the fire and the rescue. I'm sorry, fire, paid EMS and volunteer EMS. It sounds like it's working well. I know we had some concerns, but I think there's some with the immediate leadership changes in Reiner and some of those issues. I think moving forward that we'll just have clear communication. Does that sound like where we're at?
So I just have a question. So we're going to try the new communication thing and then see how that goes. And then if that doesn't seem to be working, we can look at something else like the committee idea. I just want to make a comment. I have learned so much tonight, and I feel like I have so much more to learn. So I want to thank people for educating us. I mean, oh.
Very much appreciate you guys coming out tonight, sitting 2 hours in here with us. Come back on second and fourth Mondays, too.
All right, do we have a motion to come out of work session?
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any discussion? Madam Clerk, you'll please call the roll.
Supervisor Shepherd,
Aye.
Supervisor Bone,
Aye.
Supervisor Dematz,
Aye.
Supervisor Biggs,
Aye.
Supervisor King,
Aye.
Supervisor Fidzikowski,
Aye.
Chair Blevins.
Aye.
7 aye.
All right, we stand adjourned. Thank you all.
I did.